Given that the marketing environment is so cluttered, it's important for marketers to capture consumers' attention. This module on exposure, attention, and perception discusses ways to do that. Once attention is captured, for messages to exert influence, it is critical for consumers to perceive and comprehend the messages as marketers intend. Thus, this module describes the sequential steps of exposure, attention, perception, and comprehension, and why each step is critical for a marketing message to exert influence. Now we are going to focus on a specific concept related to attention and perception that was identified in the field of psychology, but is highly relevant to marketing practice today. The just noticeable difference, also known as the difference threshold, is the minimum level of stimulation that a person can detect 50% of the time. Imagine that you volunteer for an experiment. The researchers ask you to hold 2 small amounts of sand in each hand. As the experimenter slowly adds tiny amounts of sand to one hand and asks you to say when you notice the difference that one hand feels heavier than the other, the smallest weight difference that you can detect at least half of the time is the just noticeable difference. Here is an example in the context of sound. If a decibel level change from 60 decibels to 62 decibels is undetectable, but a change from 60 decibels to 63 decibels can be detected, we know that the initial stimulus of 60 decibels to a change of 3 decibels is the just noticeable difference. It is important not to confuse the just noticeable difference and the absolute threshold. While the difference threshold involves the ability to detect differences in stimulation levels, the absolute threshold refers to the smallest detectable level of stimulation. The absolute threshold for sound, for example, would be the lowest volume level that a person could detect, so whether or not music is playing at all. The just noticeable difference would be the smallest change in the volume that a person could sense, so whether playing music goes up or down. The amount of change necessary to be discernible is not an absolute amount, but is related to the initial intensity of the stimulus. For example, imagine you walk into your favorite retailer or look online and see that they are discounting a $250 shirt by $5. This may be perceived by the consumers, or may not be perceived by consumers as a meaningful change in price. Alternatively, discounting a $25 shirt by $5 likely would. Therefore, the just noticeable difference threshold is often described as a percentage, that is, the amount of change in the intensity of a stimulus divided by the original intensity of that particular stimulus. Apparel retailers have found that discounting the price of a garment by less than 20% does not usually result in consumers' perceptions of a meaningful change in price, but discounting the garment by 20% or more usually does. So we need to know what consumers will notice and perceive as meaningful. So I'd like to note that this particular threshold will vary within industries, contexts, and consumer segments. So here we've got the example of apparel retailers and 20%, but is that always going to be the case? Can you think of examples where this might differ, and why might this be? For instance, the just noticeable difference in terms of price might vary when you're shopping in a retailer whose focus is on price. So if you're in Aldi, for example, where their the low price is part of their value proposition, people are implicitly focused on comparing prices. So they prime you to think in terms of price. Separately, some consumer segments are more price sensitive than others. You can probably think of yourself or friends and family members who really pay attention to price versus others who are less sensitive to changes. So for one consumer, they might notice a 10% change, whereas another consumer might be less likely to do so. Relatedly, some marketers have suggested that renaming the phenomenon as the just meaningful difference, the JMD, highlights the fact that the just noticeable difference should not only be discernible to the consumer, but should also signal meaningful change. So in the example above, a consumer should be able to perceive that the price of $250 is discounted by $5 has changed, but they would likely not perceive the discount as meaningful. Therefore, in order for a change to affect consumer behavior, it must be noticed as well as perceived as meaningful. So I'd like to take a minute and see if there are any economists who are watching this, or think about your economics classes that you've taken in the past. maybe you're starting to think about the just noticeable difference in how it relates to the price elasticity of demand. How are they similar and how are they different? So, for those of you who maybe recall the term but don't remember what it is, the price elasticity of demand is a measure that captures the responsiveness of a good's quantity demanded to a change in price. So more specifically, it's the percentage change in quantity demanded in response to a 1% change in price when all of the determinants of demand are held constant. So what's similar between these concepts, the price elasticity of demand and the just noticeable difference? Well, on the one hand, we're both talking about changes and how consumers respond to changes in price. But here is one big difference. And this is one of the fundamental differences between the field of economics and consumer psychology. So economists view people as rational decision makers, and the price elasticity of demand is assumed to be constant. So prices go up, demand goes down. But what this concept fails to recognize is that consumer behavior is not linear. There are thresholds at which we perceive changes or perceive them as more meaningful. Above those thresholds, changes will influence us. Below those thresholds, we perceive them as the same. You're going to get a chance to see this in the practice activity, in the application activity that I'm going to ask you all to do. But again, a fundamental difference is that the price elasticity of demand concept is a smooth linear curve, whereas the just noticeable difference suggests that there are big discontinuous jumps in changes where above a certain threshold, changes make a difference, below them they don't. Also, importantly, the just noticeable difference differs from the price elasticity of demand concept in that it is a broader concept. So price elasticity of demand applies just to price, whereas the just noticeable difference pertains to a number of marketing stimuli. Related to that, what are some marketing contexts where meaningful differences matter beyond simply price? When do we want consumers to notice changes? Take a second and think about that. We likely want consumers to notice when we have made product improvements, so new and improved models. Anytime there's a new technology update, such as a new smartphone or a smartwatch, or a new model of an athletic shoe, manufacturers and marketers go out of their way to point out those upgrades. They want to make sure people notice them and perceive them as meaningful, and people will pay more for them. Anytime there's rebranding or repositioning, businesses, marketers, organizations, manufacturers want people to notice that as well. So for instance, if you're familiar with Juniper downtown in Boise, they recently changed their menu and they have taken great pains to point out the fact that they've got a new, more streamlined menu. We've already discussed discounts in the context of sales. Anytime there is a reduction in price, organizations, businesses want people to notice that. It's a positive change. And then also service time decreases. 10-Minute Oil Change is an oil change service provider that differentiates themselves by providing a noticeably faster level of service than other competitors. So there are times when we definitely want people, consumers, to notice changes. But are there instances where we might not want them to notice? Take a second and think about that. It's oftentimes the opposite side of the coin of when we do want people to notice things. So for instance, anytime there's a price increase, marketers and manufacturers are not necessarily nefarious. Sometimes price increases are the result of costs going up for input products. And so manufacturers have to pass the cost down to the consumer. So imagine you may be familiar with Amigos Salsa, a local salsa brand. If the tomatoes that they are buying go up in terms of cost per pound, they may need to raise their prices in order to cover that. Otherwise, then they lose on their margin. So in order to raise prices, such that consumers don't notice, they need to raise it in a small amount that is lower than consumers' just meaningful difference. Alternatively, manufacturers may decrease the amount of volume that they include in a package rather than increasing the price. Similarly, though, we wouldn't want consumers to notice the difference. And then anytime there are service time increases, like waiting in a doctor's office, or again, back to the automotive example, you don't want people to notice those. So a difference between 10 and 11 minutes might not be noticeable, but a difference between 10 and 15 minutes might be. Depicted here is an example visually of how stimulus changes in marketing, where knowing the just noticeable difference can help us achieve our marketing objectives. So this example has to do with price. So here, we might not want consumers to notice price changes, specifically an increase. So an increase from $10 to $15, that represents an increase of 50%. On the other hand, an increase from $10 to $12 and then $12 to $15 represents a price increase of 20 and 25% respectively. So making changes gradually keeps the price increase under consumers' just noticeable difference threshold. This second example, taken from the Starbucks website, has to do with rebranding. Sometimes marketers update their logos in subtle ways, smoothing out images, updating colors to reflect a modern palette. In these cases, brands may not want consumers to consciously recognize the changes. So as you can see with the Starbucks logo change from 1987 to 1982, the changes were pretty minor, likely in order not to trip consumers' just noticeable difference threshold. However, sometimes organizations make dramatic changes, and these often coincide with efforts to reposition or create new associations in consumers' minds. For instance, from 1992 to 2011, this is a pretty substantial change. This coincided with their launch of a mobile platform in January 2011, and they also overhauled their menu in tandem with the rebranding effort. So aligned with that new menu, new digital platform, they introduced a new modern, fresh logo to try to position Starbucks as a modern brand in the minds of consumers. In summary, the just noticeable difference principle is applied not only to the price, but to every aspect of the marketing mix, such as packaging, slogan, logo, advertising, so that these aspects can be perceived as better if the change is positive and unchanged if the modification is negative.